my initial sort of introduction into working on music was not knowing anything initially. Working alongside Justin Harris and Diesel, actually randomly Diesel from Rocky and Diesel. And we were working in a small studio in Southgate, which is in someone's garage, and I am desperately trying to remember what speakers we had there. I believe it might have been NS10s, but nothing beyond that. When we freaks, Justin and myself, got our first sort of bit of money, once we kind of established, we were running Alesis. We were so chuffed that we bought these Alesis blue monitors. I'm trying to remember, I think Monitor 3s or something like that. And I ran those for quite a lot of time. I used to think they were the best thing ever. Historically, they're probably good speakers, but historically, looking back, yeah, we just did what we needed to do. It was one of those things, kind of flying blind and not really understanding. I wasn't really delving into actually how to make music. It was more like, this sounds good, let's go with it. I mean, there was the craft was in the innocence of it all. The TB2s became the staple and have been, or up until very recently, part of my studio, and they just stayed with me. And then more recently, I managed to upgrade to these wonderful things. I made this album as Power Dance, which was a collaborative with lots of people, like-minded people, and we made this sort of New York-inspired disco, post-punk, kind of mishmash of music that felt suitable for the times we were in. And it was really well received. It was in Guardian Top 100 albums of that specific year. I can't remember what year it was exactly, it's 2016, 2017. And off the back of that, it generated quite a lot of interest. The interest came predominantly for me in the world I was in from Horsemeat Disco, who are very dear friends. And we started to work on an album. And that was my sort of foray into realising that actually being behind the camera and not behind the scenes and not in front of it was, I felt more comfortable in that space. I kind of have moved away from feeling like I needed to have the spotlight on me, and learning to become a producer for other people or other artists is a very kind of selfless thing, because you have to get into their heads and try and understand what kind of music that they want to make or how you feel that they should be portrayed. And so Horsemeat Disco was a real learning curve for me, in that it was like, okay, this is a really interesting project, and I got to open doors for me with working with Kathy Sledge and loads of different people. Alongside this, my relationship with Honey Dijon, which is historical, I've known her for 30 years, she was signed to Classic, which is my label. I started to get involved in her first album with just doing some work on it, drum production, various different bits and pieces. And then that progressed into, okay, let's make an album together. And we worked on Black Girl Magic, and that became a labour of love for a good 2 years, which came out on Classic last year. And during that time, I found like I was honing my skills in how to not just be a writer and a songwriter and a producer and a collaborator, but also trying to use all of the skills and all the things that I've learned historically. So that's kind of come from A&R and DJing, and put all of those things into one place. Future projects and aspirations. One of those is to get a newer, bigger pair of speakers. That'd be interesting. I'm thinking about putting a space together where I can have a slightly bigger listening room. It's very cozy here. I go to work a lot of third-party studios, which is great, but it's a good vibe, good energy here. And I am sort of working actually predominantly from here, and we've been out in the States quite a lot, in LA and New York, working on Honey Dijon's new album, which I'm very excited about. I think that's interesting to have followed this curve and to understand and be inspired by Renaissance, which is rooted in our music, to then leapfrog from that into something that we can create in our space, and try to aspire to the levels that she reached with that music. I think the whole album actually for me was incredibly inspiring, especially from a songwriting and arranging perspective. So that's a big thing. And then I've been approached, well actually Chris, Honey and myself have been approached off of the back of Beyonce to work on a musical in New York, and I can't really say too much about that, but it was one of those, is this not what everyone would expect us to do, having been presented quite a lot of different options with a lot of big artists, and do we always do it differently? Yes, and so yes is the answer to that. And so for the next couple of years I'm going to be entrenched in sort of working on something which I think is going to be pretty epic and magical. And then from that on it's just keep making music. That's all I've ever done, and see what happens. There's a lot. I have a world of records that surround me in the other room, and that comes from various places, whether it's from dance music, whether it's from soul, whether it's from any version of dance, from disco, house, techno, etc. So I usually have someone from each of those worlds that inspires me in different ways. The number one in my life is Prince. The greatest inspiration, the most records that I own, I buy him, I'm obsessive. Beyond that would be people like Bowie. And then in house music, I think really there's a number, but Lil Louis is probably top of the tree when it comes to music and production, because he was so otherworldly and in a different space. When the way he approaches dance music is very different, and that appealed to me. That same thing applies to Derek Carter. And then when we get into producers, Quincy Jones probably still number one. But I am a big fan of people like Jay Dilla, and yeah, the list is broad and pretty wide. But I generally like people that have a slightly different approach to making music, not the obvious things, and so that kind of appeals to me. And so a lot of my synths and various different things represent those influences and inspirations. For me, when I heard dance music for the first time in the 80s, it felt like the future, and it doesn't feel like the future anymore, and that's because it isn't. But I do think that there's a way of pushing dance music into the future, and I think a lot of that is coming actually from the R&B and hip-hop world, which is insane, but it's because they have a different roots in it. So they have different roots in it, so they're exploring it in a different way. I think dance music's greatest battle, its greatest struggle, is that the people have too much history. And I think the way that it's going to evolve and change is that it has to come from different genres, and that fascinates me. And so that's the space that I kind of try to exist in, is just how do we move this forward, how do we change things, and what do we do that evolves and is different, but is also for everyone, not just, okay, I'm going to buy a modular because I can do sounds that no one else has done before, but then I can also spend 20 minutes being completely indulgent and make these expressive and amazing art pieces, but like, how many people are going to listen to that? And then you get to a point where it's like, well, those records like Love Can't Turn Around and all these sort of amazing futuristic dance records that came out in the 80s were on top of the pops. They were hits, and now everyone's terrified of that, and then all of a sudden someone like Beyonce comes along and kind of tears that apart, and I think that's going to inspire a whole new world of sort of dance music and producers, and that's kind of inspiring to me.